Welcome to Regional Arts Australia's conversation series. My name is Mary Jane Warfield and I'm the Regional Arts Fund Manager for Regional Arts Australia. I'm joining you today from Lepanto Alice Springs and I'm on Aranda country. Regional Arts Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians throughout the land and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 6th session of the Artlands Conversation series. What happens when we slow down and pay attention? All of the Artlands programming is supported by the Australian Government's Regional Arts Fund. And firstly today, a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our speakers. So today's session, as you might have noticed, will be Auslan interpreted and closed captioning is available. If you wish to enlarge the view of the Auslan interpreter, please scroll over their video square and there'll be a drop-down menu where you can select pin video. This will make that presenter's screen larger, and then that will be the feature screen for your view. There are 2 Auslan interpreters today, David and Claire. They will interpret for about 15 minutes each, and then they'll swap over. So you'll need to do that process each time to maintain a larger screen size. And now down the bottom of your screen, as you're all probably familiar with Zoom, there's chat and Q&A. So I'd like to invite you to say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from, because this is a national presentation. And then in the Q&A, that is just for questions for the panelists. So I'll moderate those questions and we'll have those at the end of the session. There might not be time to get through all of them, but please do put your questions in the Q&A and then chat in the chat. As I said before, today's topic is what happens when we slow down and pay attention. The panel will explore the relationship between self, practice and place in the current global and local environments. Recent events have forced many of us to slow down, to alter where and how we work, and to reconsider the ways in which we interact. This slowing down and imagining is something artists on this panel have explored through their creative practice. Let's consider the ways restrictions have made us all think more creatively, how physical isolation might lead us to imagine an alternative to the busy contemporary lifestyles we lead, to imagine a better future. Today's panelists are Jacqueline Scotcher, Gareth Hart and Bronwyn Bancroft. I'd like to especially thank Bronwyn for joining us at such short notice. It's a real pleasure to have you in the conversation today. It is to have and the conversation will be facilitated by Alana. Alana is an artist and writer who lives on Murruwurrung country in the northwest of Australia. Now, all of our panelists, there's a lot of information about them. It's on our website, so I'm not going to read out bios for each panelist because I want to get stuck into the conversation. So for more information about our panelists, please see our website. And I'll now hand over to Alana to further introduce the panelists and facilitate the conversation. Thanks, Alana.
Thanks, MJ. Beautiful introduction. Bronwyn, can we please? There we are. Okay, so we're all present. We might just start with the conversation, getting a brief overview from all of our speakers about their art practices and also about how ideas and practices of slowness may have been present in their practices prior to the pandemic and also during. Were there anything that prompted you to work or think in different ways? Bronwyn, can we start with you first?
Sure. I'm currently on a Wakbul land in the Bundjalung Nation in New South Wales. I am living and working on country. It's not my particular area of Australia, but I'm part of the Bundjalung Nation. One of the things that I found, look, I've been catapulting from the age of 17 to be an artist. So I have never actually stopped. And so I think that my sort of understanding about paying attention is that every day from the moment I wake up, I pay attention on a daily basis. I have so many different responsibilities within my community and nationally, locally, and to my family and to the fields that I operate in as an artist, that it's nonstop. The ramifications of the pandemic for me were very much about, I didn't have to physically turn up to meetings everywhere and go everywhere and be involved with people. So the interaction was less human and more digital. And that had a major impact on me because I live in the bush off grid on 17 acres. I'm completely self-sustainable, and I'm really working hard to be a good environmental person as an Aboriginal woman. I do feel that it made me have a sense of reassessment, but it was also a time where I did more work than I've ever done on my own work, instead of doing other things for other people and constantly trying to fulfill with expertise queries that people had all over Australia. So for me, that was really great. So it sort of suppressed that and allowed me to work in a safe environment and stay away from humans. So that's what I did. I did a lot of work. I'll never stop, but you know, that's kind of me in a nutshell. And I do a lot of stuff, so they can find that in the bio.
Yeah, yeah. And Gareth, can we please hear from you? Did you want to speak a bit about your Icons project?
Sure. Thanks, Alana, and thanks, Bronwyn. Hi, everybody. I put in the chat, but I'm broadcasting from Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung country. Yeah, I guess slowness is a really interesting concept for me in a number of ways, and it was almost not forced upon me, but there was a moment in time about 4 to 5 years ago where I took a job at a local council in my region, and lots of my creative collaborations were with local artists before that moment. And you know, local council can be quite a politicized space. And so something that was asked of me when I took the job, or just before being offered the role, was that many of those public facing outcomes for those collaborations would probably need to go on pause a little bit. It might look a little weird if working in a team that gave out funding to local community was also seen or perceived to be accessing some of the support that a local council can provide. So I sort of took it upon myself to take a bit of a hiatus. It had been about 20 years of making work in a kind of embodied dance festival, immersive environment kind of practice for about 20 years. And this moment was quite a practical thing, but it did in many ways force me to almost stop quite radically. And what has emerged since then has been a very slow re-emergence of my practice over the last sort of 4 to 5 years. And particularly one of the ways in which my practice has re-emerged, as Alana hinted, was an ongoing project called Icons that I've been working on, which is a series of short dance videos, really, really simple, ubiquitous, single take dance videos that I use my mobile phone to record. And they're really a way to, they're all in natural environments and really about a kind of site responsive dancing of place that I have been exploring for some time now, which kind of harks all the way back to my master's research about the relationship between the body and place. And this project has been really fascinating because it only really emerges when I have a really deep understanding of place, or in an attempt to develop a deep understanding of place. And that happens in a number of ways, but predominantly that happens from walking that place for long periods of time. So the sort of creative development of some of these dance videos that I've been making are just a walking practice in very beautiful places of the world that I've found myself fortunate enough to live in, like my current backdrop, which is the Sherbrooke Forest, the Dandenong Ranges National Park on Wurundjeri country where I currently am, and a few others that I've made in other places of Victoria and up in the Mallee and across into other parts of regional Australia. And yeah, these works only really emerge because I've walked them for a long, long time, months and months, and sometimes years and years. And that relationship that I've developed with a place completely informs the way that I respond to it through my body. And so slowness has been really interesting because I think as a young maker, there was 1 year where I made maybe 7 or 8 works in that year, different iterations of different dance works. And now I seem to make one work every sort of 3 to 4 years. Maybe even now I'm only really making one work, which is now just this ongoing understanding or unpacking of my relationship, my body's relationship with place. So yeah, slowness is really interesting. That's a very rambly beginning to my contribution today, but I hope that contextualizes something for everybody.
No, that's great. Thanks, Gareth. And Jacqueline, you've been working for many years on a painting practice in the around Cairns region.
Yeah,
Can you a little bit explain that to us?
great. And a pleasure to be here with everyone. This is exciting for me. Today, I'm not currently in Cairns. I'm joining from Yagle Country, northern New South Wales. But in my creative practice, I'm really interested fundamentally on how different environments make you feel, and different places make you feel differently. And in my studio practice, I look at slow movement through landscapes and try and manifest the sort of range of multi-sensory experiences through painting. So I'm interested in sort of evoking that bodily memory of experience in place rather than, say, a fixed vista or viewpoint. And in such, my paintings become quite layered. I return to them over time, interspersed by walking, coming back. It's almost like a conversation. So I see my painting practice as much out walking slowly in the landscape as it is in the studio. And that took a long time to discover. In the past, you think you're making, when you're there, paintbrush in hand, but the sort of really simple distillation is that as a painter, similar to what both Bronwyn and Gareth said, it's an ongoingness and it's a continuation of practice inside and outside the studio. So as a whole, life is the studio as such. So I spent 10 years in Cairns on Gamoy country, and I relocated there from northern New South Wales, and that was a real catalyst for this shift in my art practice. So the tropical environment was a real shock to my southern temperate system. You know, it was very humid, dual seasonal. I didn't know what to do with my hair or what to wear. You know, it was something else being in a tropical environment. But this really coerced me to slow down and drew me to these beautiful stretches of coastline and bush trails there, and pushed me to the fringes of the day, morning and evening. And the climate really makes you slow because you can't physically rush about in the tropics. I learnt fairly quickly from the locals. And this was in combination, I'm interested in anthropologist Tim Ingold's notion on wayfaring, that we live lives along paths through, around, to and from them rather than inside places. So like a meshwork. And this visualization of this philosophy really resonated as a visual thinker. I was like this. It was a motif or a way to express this movement through places. So we see paths really coming into my work, and I'm constantly on the lookout, always seeking human, non-human, paths or evidence in the landscape as well, and how they move from the ground perhaps into imagination. So that's, so mindful walking is a daily practice. That is, when I say mindful or receptive walking, I really try to eliminate distractions, simple things, phone away, podcasts out, and really attend to my own movement. And then that seems to build a reservoir of bodily knowledge that I take to when I paint. And this is a continually evolving practice, but definitely during COVID, I was actually in Brisbane for that period of time, and my paintings became, I did a series called Inscapes because it was very inward within an apartment, and being aware of my movement in a contained space, and my compositions became far more entangled within the frame, and definitely did some deep diving inwards, which was something else. The natural terrain is definitely a refuge and space that I missed during that time, but my methodology offered a way to deal with and cope with the change in situation that I was really grateful for.
Great, thanks, Jacqueline. Bronwyn, just thinking about, as you flagged earlier, you've had a many decades long, very diverse practice. A big part of that has been your involvement with the Aboriginal art collective Bumali.
Yeah.
In terms of thinking about slowness in relation to your work, we can look at slowness, which Gareth has mentioned to me via emails and conversations earlier, as a radical act, as something that's anti-capitalist, that moves against a lot of the currents of contemporary life, like globally, that are pushing for more and bigger and continuous expansion. But it is also, slowing down can also be something of privilege, of being wrapped up in a sense of privilege. And, we can see that happening now as the pandemic spreads around the world, and the different ways that it affects different communities of people. And I'm just wondering if you can share your thoughts on, within your own life and practice, the idea of slowness, the radical potential that it has, but also the privilege that's wrapped up in. Yeah.
I think I can't, my dad's Aboriginal, my mum's Polish and Scottish, and I'm the last of 7 children. My father was not allowed to be educated. My grandmother was a servant in this country, so they are bound by the framework of colonialism. My elder sister and myself were the only children in our family to be allowed to go on to do a high school certificate because it costs money. I've got 4 degrees. I finished my doctorate at 61. And I've only really done those degrees so that I could actually have an articulate conversation with the non-Aboriginal perpetrators of power in the framework that is Australia at the moment. I think the privilege, I have had no privilege. I don't get any money from my family. I've had to make and celebrate as a single parent the fact that I have graduated each of my children, 3 of them, through tertiary education, and they're all social warriors. So in my work practice, I've probably volunteered half of my life without payment for social equity. I don't get paid, but my passion is to see change in this extremely racist country and to see our place as Aboriginal people celebrated and ditch the Queen. So I want to get rid of the Queen, and I want to have the multiplicity of Aboriginal language groups that should be celebrated in this country, the existing songlines that existed well and truly like the veins of the country before any anthropologist put their foot in this country. We must rearrange and decolonise our framework so that when we do look at Australia, like Jacqueline said, she's immersing herself in Gareth. They're getting into it. They're porous. They're making it a part of their sensibility, and for that I applaud them. But we really need to go back and undo all of the tremors that have been still existing in transgenerational trauma in Australia for all Aboriginal people. So when people say, oh, that Aboriginal person won that, I'm like, well, good grief, it only took since 1777. Good on them, celebrate them. So for me, it's about celebrating, it's about working hard, it's about gifting, it's about being in the social equity space, and it's all about embracing humanity and really making sure that we treat each other properly, ethically, and with equality. Until we do that, I'm not interested in being involved in many things in Australia. I'll do what I want to do, and I always have, but I will fiercely defend my right to be independent of a post-colonial framework.
Great. Gareth, do you want to share any thoughts around the idea of slowness as a radical proposition and the privilege within that? Or I do have other questions for you, but if you want to add anything in there.
I just thank you, Bronwyn, for sharing that. Just incredibly insightful. Yeah, I think I sort of reflected in some of our pre-chats with the group that I'd maybe proposed that notion to you in email in isolation, that slowness is maybe a radical act. And I think we were talking a few days ago that it's almost impossible to divorce that idea of it being radical, but also having privilege in it, because you can only protest because you have an inherent privilege, or and I fully take on board everything Bronwyn's saying, but there's a very interesting relationship between those two concepts, I think, that may sit outside this conversation, or I invite the audience to share some thoughts on the nature of radical and privilege and politicization in the chat. But yeah, I don't have much more to add to that, other than I'll probably go away and think on it slowly for quite some time.
Yeah. I know you've been thinking a bit about, you were a previous participant in the Australia Council Future Leaders program, and in your role as an artist and also working within the arts, within arts organisations, you've been thinking about slowness and softness in positions of leadership, and the importance of that, and also the struggle to kind of implement that. Do you have any like real life experiences where that has played out for you that you could share?
Yeah, I guess my first reflection is just that I would extend it to almost be the impossibility of slowness particularly within an organisational context. And I think that is really about the structure that sits around our kind of industry, and I think is probably a little bit of a residue or an inheritance from deep-seated gig economy kind of values that exist in the arts, and that sense of needing to live project to project, or the nature to grow, or be better or bolder or bigger than the last thing you did. So yeah, I wonder if it's possible. From an organisational perspective, I was working in Mildura on Latchi Nyeri Nyeri country for a couple of years until recently. And one of the first things I did when I got there, inspired by a mentor of mine who works in kind of the regional landscape, I'd never really been to Mildura before, and she said to me, "Oh, the first thing I'd do if I was you is to map that community, get a sense of who's there." And you know, I think she meant it as a fairly sort of cut and dry, process of getting to know a place and its people. But I, of course, as a creative being at heart, took that to its nth degree, and I created an exhibition called Mapping Mildura, where for a month I spent the month in the gallery. And asked the community to come into the gallery and write the name of somebody they found significant on a post-it note, and then we pin that to the wall, and then with exponential amounts of red thread, just sort of mapped all of the social and personal connections of Mildura between all these post-it notes, and then further I asked the people who are coming in to write the post-it notes to grab a pencil and write a memory of that person onto the wall. And at the end of the exhibition, we took a couple of photos of the map, and it was beautiful, and it's a hero image, and it has a marketing implication and whatnot. But then we didn't erase all of the words on the wall. We just painted over them. And I don't know if this is considered a kind of act of slowness. I'm not sure I'd thought about it in the time, but thinking about that project now, the nature of that was to embed the stories of the people into the building we were working in. Interestingly, I was thinking about that in a sort of past and future historical context. And interestingly, that building has now been sold recently, and I think will be turned into maybe Victoria's only faster pasta restaurant. So definitely not a creative outlet, but those stories and those the memories of the community really are embedded into the wall of that building. Whilst it's not so much how to run an organisation with a value of slowness, I do think about that sense of time and slow time, that those stories are now embedded into that building. And I guess the reason I went to that example is my answer to your question, Alana, is no, I don't really have any examples of it, of how to embody slowness in an organisational setting, because I think it is incredibly difficult. The expectations on artists and organisations and administrators continues to increase. And I think it is incredibly problematic in our industry. And I put a social media post up recently that said, I'm talking on this panel about slowness, full caveat, I'm very good at it, but I just never do it. because I never find time to really slow down. Anyway, they're my thoughts.
Jacqueline, in terms of your practice, do you feel like, you know, with this notion of wayfaring and walking, do you feel that slowness is a place that you are able to access and tap into? Is it a destination that you are in, or is it something kind of on a horizon you're heading towards?
Yeah, this is something that I really appreciate about creative practice, is that it gets sort of, you know, into your bones. It's a real constant. And so the time spent making this practice becomes embedded in everyday life. And indeed, I think it's really held me in good stead, and also treating practice and life as the horizon, something that is a constant. It's there, but it's not in reach. You know, it's not a destination, something that's finished or rounded or has answers. It's a continuum. And wayfaring as an approach sees it as a continuum. And indeed, I see this conversations like this as a continuum of this practice. My practice has necessarily and very privileged been a solo pursuit. And now, upon reflection, I treat it with rigor, and I want to share what I've learned personally, but also hear from others and build, you know, this meshwork of paths, you know, deepen that tapestry of knowledge. So to answer your question about something to tap into, for me, it is something I come back to often. And we spoke previously, I have a now 4-month-old, and so time to, you know, meditate personally, you know, or go for a walk in the morning is now, you know, it hasn't happened since before Christmas. But I find that this practice, I find these moments attending to how I move from one place to another, or, you know, living on the coast here, attending to the tide lines, is a way to embed that practice within daily life. And that slowness, it seeps in, you know, it seeps into your soul and the way that you move around on a daily basis. So for me, it's an undertow, you know, maybe heading out to the horizon that's there, but it's definitely not in reach. Yeah.
Yeah. And Bronwyn, I'm just, you know, you can draw on any example from your life if you like, but I'm sort of thinking about Bumali as an organization that's lasted a long time. Are there particular instances where, you know, as a collective of Indigenous people, you've kind of, I'm sure there's countless, you've been able to exert collectively something that needed to slow down? Have you been able to kind of shape the way that you work as an organization in a way that might be counter to, say, some of the mainstream organizations and non-Indigenous organizations and the thrust of how they operate in Australia? How have you been able to work a little bit differently to that?
Whoa, it's huge. So Bumali's been around for 34 years. So Bumali was established in 87, and there's a bunch of people, the 10 of us that got together. It's been amazing. So it started with the splash, but we were all told that we weren't Aboriginal, that we couldn't do our work, that we lived in the city, so we were fake. So that was like, oh yeah, thank you, humanity. So we all fought really hard to put up our own exhibitions. We largely got supported by Gary Foley and Uncle Chicka Dixon, who were Gary was the director of the Aboriginal Arts Board at the time. It was called the Aboriginal Arts Board, not the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Arts Board. That shows you how politically everything shifts. And Uncle Chicka Dixon, who was a revered elder, was the chairperson. So what he did was gave us 12 months rent, and that got us going. Michael Riley organised that. We all went in and sort of badgered him, and he said, well, here's 12 months rent, go away and create. that was the first and only time that we've been unencumbered by the bureaucracy of government intervention and resistance. We have always had, like I've gone into Bamali twice and saved it from a remit of $381,000 and the loss of the building 12 years ago. So I've been volunteering for 12 years to get Bamali back on track. The high level of interference by government in terms of any kind of sponsorship has been incredibly frustrating. You get this much money to do this many things. And I think one of the greatest things we've done in the last 2 or 3 years is to defy elitism and give all of our artists a chance so that we run 60 artists. We've got 60 members. It's huge. And, you know, you think about a commercial gallery, they might have 20. And we're doing this on 130K from New South Wales Create. It's appalling. And we have to fight for everything. We never get recurrent funding. We have to have our best warrior on all the time. I'm sick of it. I am full of fatigue, but I will never stop fighting for the next generation to have the opportunities that I had. And Michael Riley and Tracy Moffat and Fiona Foley, Brenda Elcroft, Aaron Meeks, who recently died, you know, Fernanda Martins, Avril Quayle, Michael Riley. I mean, you know, we were supported. So I would love to see the small amount of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists actually supported without any, you know, we're a small group, so just support us. If you're in a mainstream funding organisation, support it. Stop worrying about your elitist framework and your inherited colonialist framework and start looking at all of the people that are creating as human beings who belong in a family and a community. And that's where, like, that's my commitment. And I will continue to be involved in Bamali until I see it treated in the same way that Opera Australia is treated. You know, get with the program, everybody, and start supporting this fantastic organisation and cherish and celebrate your First Nations artists. So it's been a real struggle, I can tell you. But I'll never give up. That's one of my catchphrases. I will never, ever give up.
Yeah, well, it's a great testament that it's still operating and strong. Do you feel that there are, you mentioned supporting the next generation of artists now. Do you feel like they're entering a cultural and artistic environment that is more accepting than what you encountered in the 80s?
No, it's really funny. I just finished a First Nations writers workshop today at Lennox Head, which I just dropped into, similar to this. But it's like there are still the areas of quarantining First Nation people. It's like, if you don't fit into mainstream, well, we'll make you First Nations, but we're going to put you, you know, it's like the art catalogue. They always put the traditional artists first and the urban artists second. If you go to the library, if you have an Australian catalogue, they'll put the white artists first and the Aboriginal people second. It's so problematic that it's tedious. So we have to decolonise our thinking. I think what they get now is that they have more support in safe places like the Koori Heritage Trust and, you know, Bamali, and there are several organisations that offer a safe space. But it's really about the ramifications of being an artist in the mainstream where the tremor occurs. And some people become very popular and get owned by the mainstream, and that's highly problematic as well, because we need to bring everyone up at the same frequency. We don't want to have elitism and then have like the majority of our community left behind.
Gareth, I'm just curious to know what your ideal moment or your ideal day of slowness is. Can you describe that somehow?
I guess it depends on where I am. So to circle back into one of the recurrent themes of today's chat, which is this nature of walking. currently, like I said, I live on Wurundjeri country in the Dandenong Ranges of Victoria, which is quite a mountainous, steep place, and have spent the last couple of years on up in Mildura, which is possibly the opposite of a mountain. It's maybe the flattest place I can imagine. So it depends on where I am. When one of my favourite ways, I was very fortunate to work part-time in Mildura. So I had quite a lovely balance of work and practice and life and slowness, much more slowness in my life then. And my ideal day was often throwing a few muesli bars in a backpack and a bottle of sparkling water and just walking for 4 hours, through a couple of really stunning kind of inland lakes and some salt flats up there and lots of sort of really arid, dry country up there. So just walking for, I don't know when else I have 4 hours to do just one thing like that. And I would often do that on a day off. And that just started as a way to, attend to my middle-age health routine, which, waxes and wanes the older I get. But it really, really became so many other things. It became about my mental health. It became about processing work things. It became about perceiving the place that I was walking. And it sort of, led to lots of thoughts about how the nature of practice, the nature of art being just a process of perceiving something, perceiving the world, noticing the world, and then sharing that back.
How does it feed into your practice as someone who moves, your dance?
Yeah, super interesting. So again, this Icons project really solidified then. So walking these places for 4 hours and getting to know them quite intimately, I would then almost be, without being too esoteric about it, almost be moved by the landscape to embody that, or to embody my relationship with it. So to notice relationships between my architecture and the architecture of nature, to notice the sensations and perceptions that were coming my way, and just to respond to those. And I guess in the context of a conversation around slowness, what it did, obviously walking is a much slower act than most dancing, than lots of other sporting activities. So slowness allowed me to perceive the place more, and that perception really started to almost be a practice in itself. The idea of noticing more, the idea of seeing micro details and sensing connections started to become a practice in itself. So yeah, I used to really think I had a dance practice, a really rigorous dance practice, and then I often categorized myself as an artist, and now I think I just talk about perceiving things and allowing that to have influence in the way that I move. And there really is no more joyous way to explore a place than to dance it, I have to say. I mean, I'm very biased, but.
And Jacqueline, you mentioned you were living in Brisbane during lockdown. So you've moved a little bit between regional places in Australia and more city centres or urban centres and stuff. How does that impact your practice?
Yeah, there's this real pull up and down the East Coast. I grew up in Lismore, so Bundjalung, right near Lennox Head, where you were today, Bronwyn, and then moved up north, and then back to Brisbane. And my timeline sped up a bit to come back to a regional area during COVID and during pregnancy as well. I thought this needs to happen far more quickly than I expected, because I wanted a very slow start to my son's life indeed. And so I think it's passing on those lessons that I have accumulated. And also, I think that it's having a respectful understanding of each of these places, up and down the coast. And I'm also really excited to travel and approach new landscapes in this way of slow movement that attends and is respectful of the environment too. And I also feel in doing this, how it's changed my art practice is I think I used to make the paintings that I thought I should be making about a place. There was probably and particularly the speed. It's interesting how Gareth said with their practice that the speed slowed down, and perhaps it is a middle-age thing that I was ready to slow down, but I used to paint a lot at a far more rapid pace, and I don't know if I thought that would bring some sort of energy or life to the work, when actually it wasn't authentic of my understanding and bodily knowledge of that place. And I needed to, what I've learned through different environments making me feel differently, is that you need to really authentically notice that environment for that to be, and I don't think it's not a performance, it's a re-emplacement, it's a reflection, it's a conversation, and without that authentic knowledge, built up through that slow practice layered over time, this through multiple years of knowing, let alone, the generations that others have that I don't necessarily draw from. It's something that I've realized it's slow practice rather than being perhaps mundane or taking the foot off the pedal when it comes to making artwork. It actually instilled what I think is on the path to more authentic work. Yeah.
Great. So this is sort of the last question that I'll propose before we move into some Q&As with those who are listening and joining us. But a kind of a current across all of the things that you've said today is an equation with slowing down with place and a very bodily feeling and relationship with that place. I think, like for me, in Australia, I can't really think about place without also thinking about the fact that we're on Aboriginal land and that land has been stolen as well, and that my presence here as a non-Indigenous person as well comes at the cost of a lot, like a terrible amount to Indigenous people. And that materializes as much through things like frontier violence as well as representation and the visual and artistic fields that we're practicing in. So I'm just thinking, like, this is a big question, but how do we begin to build and talk about and think about our connection with place, with Indigenous country, with our artistic practices that are being shaped by that land, in a way that is hopefully ethical and not further damaging to the world that we live in. Maybe Bronwyn, you can, do you feel like going first in this?
No, well, look, I will.
It's a big, I know it's a big thing, but I think it's really important for us to begin to think about,
As I said before, I think it's like, ultimately, I go back to what Jacqueline and Gareth have both been saying, and what they're doing is immersing themselves into a spiritual resonance that's been existing in this country for 60,000 years or more. The fact that we had to even argue that we existed in this country before Cook came it indicates how ridiculous the whole paradigm is. That is where we have a major problem. So I think what we all love the country. I mean, if we're here, I mean, the mining people don't, they just think about the money. But, simple mortals like us who relay and live and immerse and feel the country are only really portals for our visual language to be given to other people to illustrate our connection. And I think, we have to be kind to each other. We can actually protest against the people that are raping, pillaging, putting gas fields in, doing silica mines, damming our riverways. We can fight those people, but we must not fight each other. The fighting is terribly damaging to everyone, and the transgenerational trauma, we live through it every day. It's not where we need to be. So as individuals, we can move within our circles and talk with each other and resonate with each other, but we have to love and be kind to each other, because love will always find a way. Whereas hatred will only ever perpetuate the situation that we're currently living in.
That's beautiful wisdom, Bronwyn. Yeah. Jacqueline or Gareth, is there anything? I guess a mutual point that Bronwyn has just brought up is that kindness to each other, but also loving the place, you know, loving that country.
And that is a word that I keep coming back to, is a sense of stewardship. Is that through practice, I know personally, I've developed a deep sense of stewardship and care, and sharing my practice. You know, it's often thinking, I think many times, why am I doing this? I could be doing far more, you know, productive things. The irony is slowness and productivity. It's a constant push and pull that I'm working with. But by harboring an individual sense of stewardship, you know, a love and care for environment and therefore others, the people, the stories, the memory, the history of places will then build and elicit change moving forward. I think I'm drawing from my personal experience, because that is the transformation that I am experiencing, and I'm hoping that that is something that others do as well.
Yeah, my reflections just extend both Bronwyn's and Jacqueline's, that yeah, this relationship with place, it's the beginning, you know, and it has to be, it's almost non-negotiable. If I'm going to make work on country, about place, connected to environment, then I have to develop a relationship with that myself, which is based in an idea of respect and care. And from that's my baseline. So then every time, you know, then it's active listening to elders, it's active listening to kind of traditional owners. It's constantly developing that sense of my connection or my understanding or my relationship with place. But if I'm not developing something myself, then it's all a little bit token. I can't deny. Yeah.
No, I think you've just brought in an important word here, I think, which is respect, Gareth. And some of that is on one level about respect to place and country, but also the idea of slowing down can be connected to respect for self in the world that we live in, you know, and crafting that important space between each other. Does anyone want to add anything further before we move into questions?
I just want to add that, like, also out of all of the conversations that we've just said, the word that comes to mind most strongly for me is trust. So when we establish trust and know it's not going to be broken, then we will really heal this country.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Okay, MJ, are there any questions?
Hi. Just firstly, thank you so much for that conversation. It's very heartfelt and great to hear from each of you, your different perspectives. I have a question that's come through to me, not on the Q&A. I'm just going to bring it up. So this is a question from Regional Arts Australia. I'm our executive director. We're obviously taking, in our busy lives and our non-slow work practice, taking some time today to consider and reflect with you all. So as a national arts organisation that's been going faster and faster and is constantly responding to needs, we're wondering what you would like to see we could do as an organisation in our processes and for our network.
That was from Ros Abercrombie?
That's from Ros Abercrombie, our executive director. So, sorry, we can't type into the Q&A. So I'd also welcome any people who are tuning in to please type questions in the Q&A, but I don't currently have any. So we'll go with Ros's question, please.
That's a great question. Who would like to start? How can regional arts in our practices and programs implement something slower and more relevant to you as regional artists?
I find that a really difficult question to answer because I've lived in Sydney for 38 years.
Yeah.
Even though I lived in my traditional lands for 18 months and now I'm back on country, I find it really difficult because we at Bamali, our regional artists are the most important component. We pursue our regional artists and give them so much support. And what we find, I think, if I can talk purely from the perspective of our Aboriginal artists that are members in Bamali, is that the support that they lack in regional areas because sometimes they're shy and it's largely, maybe a non-Aboriginal organisation and there may be one contact person in there. Do they know that person? Do they feel comfortable? Do they feel safe to go into that space? And if they do, then they get major benefits from having that wonderful relationship with regional arts and then the city gallery, like being in that city gallery. And I think that if there can be support for the Aboriginal artists that really do exist in these small country towns, but really takes a lot of courage to get in there and go and try and make contact, and having a computer even is a major hurdle. Who's got a computer? They may have an iPhone. They live out of town, an hour out of town for a start, so not involved in the complexity of that, even that small town framework. So I think it'd be great to see. I saw there was an Aboriginal forum in Armidale recently, which I thought, wow, that's great. That's really great. But also the thing that I want to see is that we have to work together. So if we continue to isolate or, quarantine and make us separate to other artists or, mainstream artists, we'll continue to make a problem for each other because we need to be in conversations with each other. We need to know, that person that's doing sculpture. We need to know that person that's doing ceramics. And we need to be in contact and have friendships, professional relationships, and seek advice. And I think I really don't like the way that we get siloed. Oh, yes, we'll consider these mainstream artists and then we'll consider the First Nation artists. Or we'll pick 2 First Nation artists and we'll have 24 non-Aboriginal artists. Well, come on, guys, it's equity. So if we have a bit more parity in the conversation space and some professional pairing, mentoring, all that sort of stuff, it will really work. And I think I do see that you are doing that, though. I do see that in the regional arts. So it's just about building up those relationships. Yeah.
Sometimes I feel a bit of a divide between artists in regional Australia and art practice in regional Australia and the city itself. And art practices that are taking place in cities. But I sort of like to think of it as one big ecology that we're all a part of and connected to. And I can feel that through what you've just said, Bronwyn, about the need to not work in silos, but to, see ourselves as a larger community of artists and support each other collectively. Because what's good for someone else is good for you as well. And we can all bring each other up in that way. Gareth, yeah?
I think we're fungi. If we stop thinking we're human, we should just be fungi.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Gareth, how can Regional Arts Australia, better?
I was just thinking about a couple of years ago, I went to the first Kyneton Contemporary Art Triennial. It's a new sort of not multi-year, but a new contemporary art Biennale, but happening every 3 years. And it was the first time I'd seen, it was before the NGV had announced theirs, I think. And I remember going up to the director and saying, why a triennial? That just seems so far away. 3 years, a major contemporary art thing every 3 years. And I remember him talking to me in this amazing 2-piece Adidas tracksuit, which just added to it completely. And he said it's going to allow us to embed artists in the place for longer. We're going to put artists in residence before the event, make work of place, responding to place, and just much more connected to place. And I thought that was radical in the sense of slowness. But as far as Regional Arts Australia, and I'd probably give this answer to any body that gives out support structures or funding or whatnot, is to think less about those the calendar restrictions that we often place on things, the kind of Jan 1 to December 31 or a July 1 to June 30. And I wonder what happens if we stretch out the time of funding, or if residency is not a 12-month thing, but is a 36-month thing. Like what would happen if we stretched time a little bit in that way? That's my first thought.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of extended long practices. Jacqueline.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Gareth was saying there. I always feel I'm one step behind the application process for the next year. You know, it's like the work is there as a seed and I haven't quite developed it. And this has been ongoing for 10 years now. So, and I can't quite get, the work is percolating, but I don't know what it is to share or to apply or things like this in enough time. It's almost like the time passes and then another avenue opens. But I would encourage the notion of enduring themes and enduring conversations and practice, which Bronwyn, you touched on that. You talked about was a really nice word, a ripple or now it's gone, but these thoughts that people have been percolating for long periods of time, to elevate those and to listen, because the things that resonate take time. And this is why artists, I think, I'm excited to come into my, later in life, because I know that work will get more pure and strong. But also beyond the artwork itself is talking more broadly between artist and community about the social and cultural impact of work. And similar to what we're talking about now, we're talking about works of art without any images or slideshows of works of art, because it's the impact that it has on day-to-day living, on empathy, on community, that it is the conduit. So I've spent a long time writing about my own work and kind of extracting what it's about. And I resisted it at first, but that is where the importance lies, and it changes. And I talk to the community and even beyond artists themselves, but patrons, and discussing the impact and the shifts in life and well-being that happens through that type of understanding that comes through the arts in its special and unique way, as well, to self-realization from both artist and audience.
And great, thanks. And MJ, do we have time for another question?
We've got time for just one more. I've had two interesting ones come through, and there's one I'd like to explore more, but I don't think we've got time today. And it's from someone who works in local government, and Claudia, and she asks, how do we align today's conversation with KPIs to ensure ongoing funding? So to me, that's really a question of how does slow practice meet with colonial systems and structures? And that's a very big question.
I can answer that really quickly with an example. When I moved to Byron Bay 3 years ago, I paid for myself and fully funded the first Bundjalung women's exhibition in Byron Bay at the Lone Goat Gallery. I didn't have any funding. I paid for the gallery. I got the artists together. I paid for my daughter did the catering. We got some grog from Stone and Wood. Donation and drinks, and then I did that because that was the first time ever in Byron Bay that Bundjalung women artists, who are the caretakers, were able to display and show their work. Now, I think that's fairly phenomenal, and I think that's a pretty good example about hit the KPIs, get into the action moment and start doing things, facilitate it, go out, find those artists, get them in there, do it, make it a priority. Get women artists, all that stuff. So there's a perfect example.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We might just finish. There's a lovely question about your children's book, so I'm going to finish with that question. So it comes from, I think you pronounce it Joel. Hi, Bronwyn. I'm an early childhood teacher and I love reading your books with children. What do you think is the place of education in decolonising our thinking? And I thought that might be a nice one to wrap up on.
I'll be really brief, everyone. Look, at the end of the day, I grew up in Tenterfield. I had no books in the library about anything to do with Aboriginal culture. So I went to art school. I was told I was a shitty illustrator, so I canned it. In 1992, I got commissioned for a book, and then I did Udru and New Knuckles' book, Stradbroke Dreamtime. So now I've illustrated 42 books, of which I think I've written and illustrated maybe 15 of my own. What I've done is done a second generation. So the 35-year-olds are now reading those books to their children. So I'm into a second generation of infiltration of young minds to dislodge colonialism. So hooray for doing a book a year, 1.2 books I think they've worked out today I've done since 1992. And my commitment is to the wider society of Australia to debunk, demystify the idea that we didn't exist here and we don't have a way of talking and visually speaking to everyone. So that is why I've done those books. And I think it's inherently important that we make sure our young minds know the truth about the country from the very beginning.
Thank you, Bronwyn. That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much, Gareth, Jacqueline, and Bronwyn, for sharing really interesting insights to your work and practices. And yeah, I wish you all a lot of slow and deep thinking and life.
Beautiful. You
Thanks,
too.
Alana. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lana. Thanks, Ray.